Hi everyone, welcome to this conversation about pride. We're really excited about this one because we've got a fantastic guest with us. But before we get started, I just want to say a huge thank you and hi to all our listeners for what's becoming an exciting time here at NoraBox when we stop and have these conversations with our community on LinkedIn. It's great to have your company. My name's Donna Stevenson. My preferred pronouns are she and her. I have shoulder length brown hair and I am wearing a Nora Box grey t-shirt, and it's really great to have your company for this chat. It's also really great to be joined by the amazing Katie Allen. Katie, hi, thanks so much for your company.
Hello, thank you for having me. I'm really excited to be here.
Brilliant. Well, Katie, I'm going to give you a formal introduction, as formal as we ever get on these LinkedIn Lives, and then we'll get chatting if that's okay.
Love to, yeah.
My goodness, your resume is impressive. You are a specialist inclusion consultant, you're a coach, a TEDx speaker. You're also host of the Speaking of Inclusion podcast, which is a brilliant title. You've got decades, Katie, of experience in people and culture, and we know that you've helped thousands of leaders to be inclusive. And it's especially important when we have a conversation like the one we're going to have now about pride, about how we can support our LGBTQ plus community. So thank you for your company, Katie. Any words you want to share with folks before I've got lots of questions I want to try and get through?
No, I'm just absolutely delighted to get here, and I think this is going to be a fantastic discussion, and I'm so pleased that we're having it. So let's get cracking.
Let's
Although
do
actually,
things.
maybe what I will add, because I really love that you did your kind of image description introduction. I think that's fantastic that you did that. So I would then also like to add, for anyone that's listening without the video capability, that I am also a white woman with, of course, I've got bobbed greying brown hair currently, and I'm wearing a black vest top.
Yeah, brilliant. Thank you, Katie. So let's get started then. Tell me what pride means to you and why is a special time important?
Yeah, so this I think is one of those questions that sometimes we kind of forget to talk about, isn't it? Really, because we get used to the kind of the flags, food, and fun side of pride and kind of the parade element of it, which is fantastic. But actually, it's worth really reflecting on the fact that pride in itself started back in 1970 as a result of the Stonewall riots the year before. And this is basically, for anyone that isn't familiar, there was a police raid on the Stonewall Inn, which was kind of a very well-known at that time gay and lesbian bar, and it was this police raid that kind of kick-started the riot. And then the following year, Pride as we know it was set up as a protest march around the treatment of the LGBTQIA plus communities, we now call them, within New York at that time, and that has then spread obviously to many states, many countries, and continued ever since. And I think the reason it's important to remember that is to know that this isn't just kind of like it was for a lot of us can be a fun celebration. It's not just a fun celebration. It really is about the acknowledgement of the kind of the systems of oppression and the unequal treatment that a lot of people within the LGBTQA plus community face. And I think it is always worth acknowledging that and remembering why pride exists in the first place. It is to highlight the fact that there is this discrepancy in treatment and the legal rights and representations of people from the community. And for me, that's a really important piece that we have to remember. And that's why it's so important. So I know sometimes people say, well, when's straight pride? And it's like, okay, yeah, but maybe that's not necessary, because all of the, the rights that exist for people who identify as heterosexual or straight are completely protected. And, you aren't kind of having to Google which countries are safe for you to visit to go on holiday. That's not something you have to worry about. But as a person in a same-sex relationship, or who maybe identifies as transgender or is on another spectrum of the LGBTQA plus community, that's something that we have to do. We have to check, like, am I safe to be myself? If I go to one of these countries, could I be arrested or be killed? Like, what do I have to think about? So this for me is why pride is so important. And also it's important to say they're not exclusively events for people from the community. If you identify as cisgender or heterosexual, like, you're welcome to your love, your relationship, is completely valid and to be celebrated too, come along, like join in, but acknowledge and recognize that the purpose of this is really highlighting that, you know, rights are not equal, and we see them kind of advancing and then being eroded at various points. So, you know, we need to keep the spotlight where it should be, which is rainbow coloured.
Yeah, wonderful. Thank you, Katie. What a way to start this conversation. I'm so pleased you took us back to the beginning of that journey. The history of pride is really, really important. And lovely, I love what you say about joining together, including somebody like me, cisgendered, heterosexual female, wanting to be an ally. And I'm going to ask you about allyship in a little while. So thank you for raising that as well.
Yeah.
Together we make these differences, isn't it, for
Exactly.
our
Yeah.
community? Okay, so the next question then is kind of a similar one about what pride is, but maybe more of a personal perspective. And you've been very honest and open with us to say that you're happy to talk about your identity
Yep.
as ace. And I checked in with you that that was
You
the right
did.
terminology for me
Yeah.
to use to show respect to you, Katie. So share with me what pride means to you on a very personal level as somebody who's part of the LGBTQIA plus community and your journey, if you don't mind sharing that with
Yeah.
us.
No, absolutely. And before I do want to also say, you know, express thanks to you. I know we're going to come on to talk about acts of allyship, but even just in our conversation prior to this, having somebody say to you, am I using the correct terminology? Am I pronouncing things the correct way? And is it okay for me to say, as someone who doesn't identify in that way, to use this language? Was a significant indicator that this is a safe space. And I want to commend you and everybody at Neurobox for having the awareness to do that. And I think role modeling that type of behavior is outstanding, and like, it took minutes and it cost nothing, and yet for me it made me feel like, yeah, this is exactly the type of conversation I want to be having, and exactly the type of place that is safe for me to give you more back of myself, because I can trust that it's going to be received in the right way. So yeah, so firstly, thank you, Tat. So for people watching and listening to this, like, there is a bang on great example of just taking a few minutes just to check in, and not being afraid to ask as well, which is something I always talk about. Like, we all have this fear of saying the wrong thing. And that was a perfectly handled way to do it. So that was great.
Thank you, Katie. This is how we learn, isn't it? I don't have lived experience on a personal level of this myself. I desperately want to learn.
Yeah.
So I'm appreciative of your honesty and your wisdom to share, to guide me through. You know, a lot of people who will listen to this won't have that experience, but really want to find out more. So over to you,
Yeah.
because this is how we're going to find out more.
Yeah, absolutely. So for me personally, so as we know, it's LGBTQIA plus. There are lots of letters in there, and they are all representative of different parts of the community, and they focus not only around sexual orientation but also around gender identity, and all of those things come together. So it really is a representation of the community as a whole when it comes to people who may experience othering and marginalization. Google's free, so please pop those letters in and have a little look. What I would say, if anyone who kind of worries about, oh, there's a lot of letters, I don't know if I'm going to get them right, I kind of want to say, like, it's okay. It's one of those things that the more you say it, the easier it gets. So if you are kind of someone who wants to get it right, just keep practicing it, say it out loud, you'll get there in the end. But also know that if you get as far as LGBT and then you can't remember the rest, or you make a mistake, that's okay, because we know what you mean. And the fact that you tried is really important. So, you know, if you're only as comfortable going that far, or if you can go as far as you can, that's okay too. But I will say, so as Donna quite rightly said, they identify as ACE, which is the shortened form of asexual. So when someone makes the effort to get all the way to LGBTQIA plus, I know that they understand that I'm important, and that again is a real huge signal to me that says, okay, this is a safe space. I'm someone that I can be honest about me, because you've just taken the effort to learn that and say it all, and that's really important. And what asexuality means is it's part of the sexual orientation spectrum, and it's often summarized as quite simply being someone who experiences little or no sexual attraction. So when we think about most of the LGBTQIA plus spectrum, when we're talking about sexual orientation, it's usually around whom you are sexually attracted to, and it generally revolves around the gender of that other person. But for me, it's a bit different in that I just don't find myself attracted to anybody in that way. So I fall into the asexual camp of don't really experience sexual attraction in that way. There are many facets under asexuality. So things such as people who would identify as demisexual, and they are people who might experience some level of sexual attraction, but only after an emotional bond has been created with the person. So there's a whole range of attraction. And I say this not as someone who has known this for their entire life. I had no idea. I spent the first 40 years of my life just thinking I was a straight person, because when I kind of went to school and you learn about, sexual orientation, not that the education was particularly good, I'll add, but it was either a case of you liked boys or you liked girls, and that was the conversation. And I was kind of pretty sure I don't think I like girls, so I probably like boys, and that must be that. And I never really, you have thoughts and feelings and you wonder, like, well, is this right? It doesn't always feel right, but I don't know. And you kind of just let it ride because nothing else felt okay. And I kind of dabbled with thinking, oh, maybe I'm pansexual. I'm not really sure. And it wasn't until I learned about the existence of asexuality, and it was actually Yasmin Benoit who was talking very openly about her experiences, and she's an asexual activist. She's amazing. And I just thought, that's me. And that, and for 40 years I didn't know, and now I found it and it feels right. So I know a lot of people can get hung up on the idea of labels and whether labels are a good idea or not. But for me, using labels as a language to explain how something works was so helpful, because once I learned about the terminology, I could start to research it. I've read so many books about it, been all over the internet learning about it in various networks. And all of a sudden, I'm like, this is me, this is where I fit, and everything makes sense. And it changes the way that I have conversations now. It's changed any of my kind of romantic relationships. And it's probably worth pointing out as well, there is a difference between asexuality and aromanticism. So romantic attraction is different to sexual attraction. So people may identify as both. So someone who is aromantic would experience little or no romantic attraction as well. That's not me. So if we're going to be really specific, my identity falls into the place of asexual when it comes to sexual attraction, but pan-romantic when it comes to forming romantic bonds with people, which means it doesn't matter their gender identity. I kind of fall in love with a person for who they are. The body they possess or the way in which they decide to identify makes no difference to me. And I always used to joke when I was younger that I just fall in love with someone's brain, because it was just sort of how it was the best descriptor I had. And now it makes sense as to why. I was like, I didn't realize I didn't have the same feelings as other people, but now I do, and now I know that. So that's kind of like the potted history of being ace, and my journey. So I think it's also kind of interesting to say to people, like, I didn't know anything about this for the majority of my life, and it's only through doing my own work in inclusion that it was presented to me, and I was like, oh hell, that's me. And so I find it kind of curious when I talk to people when they say, well, how do you not know? And it's like, well, how do you know you're straight? Like you just know, but it's an option, and it's a thing that you feel. None of us choose it, or our gender identities, our sexual orientation. We don't choose these things. It's just who we are, and we need to be given access to the information to figure that piece out.
Brilliant. Katie, it's fascinating to listen to you. I'm wondering when you found the identity, and did it feel a bit like you'd found your home, you'd come home? I can almost imagine that feeling of safety and yeah, just reassurance. Please share on that.
No, honestly, emotionally, it was one of those moments when you go, oh,
Yeah, I
like,
can just imagine.
right.
Yeah.
And there's a really specific example, and it's quite niche, so people will either get it or they'll be like, what? But if anyone's a Grey's Anatomy fan, there is a scene in that with Dr. Erica Hahn, and she then has this discovery that she's actually lesbian, and the conversation kind of unfolds, and she describes it as being like glasses. And she said, for all of my life, I've just seen blobs, and now I have glasses, and I realize those blobs are like leaves on trees. And it is like that. It's like all of a sudden you have this clarity of like, oh, that's what that is. That's why that never felt right. Or, oh, that's why I made those decisions, or felt like, oh, that's what was different about me. And all of a sudden things sort of slot into place retrospectively, obviously. But then these were never conversations that took place when I was younger. This information was never available to me. So it arrived to me at the time that it arrived.
Yeah. And I think that's why it's so important now that the LGBTQIA plus community is working so hard to make sure that our children, our young people don't have some of these experiences,
Yeah.
that those of us who are, are fully formed adults by the time we find these things out about ourselves, we want to make sure that people are in a good place throughout their childhood as well,
Yeah,
and see themselves across the community, and hear
exactly.
those voices.
Yeah.
You spoke about figuring this out on your own. And again, I can only imagine how tough that must have been. And thanks for sharing that, because that will be other people's lived
Yeah.
experience, I suspect, unfortunately. How much did the professional you guide the personal you through? Because, you're a wonderfully consummate professional person.
Yeah, so it's interesting, isn't it? I mean, it was my professional choices that led me down the route to understanding this information, and that gave me the opportunity to to literally have it presented to me. And I am always curious, and I wonder that if this had been made available to me during my educational years, that would have been very helpful. If it had been made available to me during any of my professional working life, if we'd have had speakers in from the community to come and talk about their own lived experience, I would have seen myself in them, as we do in any other speakers that come in that talk about any other topics. And we can see in the comments that Kathleen's put in there something around that's how she felt when she found out about her ADHD. And it's like, sorry, I've just assumed your gender there, Kathleen. Sorry
Yeah.
about that. But there's it is that thing. The access to information is so important, and I'm class myself as being incredibly fortunate that I had access through my choices. But I also wonder, we never arrive at the work in inclusion through accident. It's usually because we've had our own experiences and we've experienced oppression in other ways, which is also true for myself. And I can't help think that I've always had that feeling of being different, and that probably drove me more towards that work to begin with, even though I didn't know why.
Ah, interesting. Well, the next question, and thank you guys. I can see in the comments we've got questions coming through. We will get to you, so please keep them coming. There's a really interesting one about some of the changes that may be coming to the UK around discussions around the LGBTQI plus community for our children. So we will come to those. Thank you, folks, for sending them through. But on the back of that, Katie, then I want to pick your brains as the wonderful professional that you are, to figure out then, what can we do to make sure that for those of us who don't have lived experience of these identities but want to be allies for individuals and our
Mm.
organisations, what can we start to do, Katie, to make sure that we celebrate, support all our wonderful differences across the communities?
Yeah. So, I mean, the first thing is get curious, right? I think,
Yeah.
I mean, for me, anybody listening and watching this will be because they're curious, because they're thinking this is interesting. So keep that up. And I just want to call out as well. So Kathleen has also popped in the comments that they use they them pronouns. So apologies, Kathleen.
Thank you for
I
sharing.
apologize for
Yeah.
that. So yeah, and it's just get curious. And on the topic of pronouns, if that's something that's of interest to you, then explore that. There are some really great resources out there. Find out why it's important. Why do people think it's important? Why does someone like me put their pronouns on their name everywhere I go? And from my perspective, it is because I recognize, as we are experiencing in real time here, not everybody uses the pronouns that we might assume because of their name or the way that they present. And, we've just seen me make a mistake, and it's okay to make a mistake, providing that you acknowledge that you've made a mistake and
Yeah.
you correct yourself and you get it right going forwards. Because that's what's important. And I would always say, whatever a person tells you is the gender that they wish to be known as, or the pronouns that they use, accept that. It may not make sense in your own head, and that's okay, but whatever they tell you, that's what you go with. So if that's something you're curious about, do the investigative work, teach yourself, do some learning, put yourself in a position and in spaces where people from the LGBTQIA plus community are. Like, get to know people that are different to you. Because again, we talk an awful lot around around transgender identity is really, really in the public eye at the minute, especially with the election coming on. And a lot of people I speak to don't knowingly have anybody in their friend circle who would identify as being transgender or non-binary. And I kind of think, like, well, A, you probably do, you just don't know it. And B, if you don't, but then how can you make space to try and find, places where you can go to learn more, to become more comfortable, so that you can know it's not just an over there thing that affects other people. It could be someone that you can love and care about too. Because when we've got our own skin in the game, we care a lot more. And for me, that's really important. I have people from all through the LGBTQA spectrum in my life, and because of that, I know so much more. So I make my choices and my decisions, and I navigate the world according to that. And I can understand it might be challenging if you don't have those frames of reference, but get those frames of reference. Move outside your comfort zone and connect with people who are different to you. And I would also say, for people who are really thinking that they do want to be allies, absolutely, we have to recognise as well that there's an intersectional element of this. And when we talk about intersectionality, it's about acknowledging that just because we're talking about pride and LGBTQIA plus right now, those people will also be members of other communities. So they will be people with disabilities, they will be people with neurodiversities, they will be people with racialized backgrounds. Like, we don't exist in a vacuum. So there will be other oppressions and situations for people to think about. So if you really are thinking about being an ally, think about allyship in its full spectrum, and get curious about all of that and what might that mean.
Yeah, I love that phrase, get curious. And I'm thinking at a grander scale, Katie, for an organization, it's about this curiosity, constructive curiosity,
Yeah,
isn't it?
yeah,
In your experience, as I say, folks will have heard the way I introduced you. My goodness, the work that you've done, the skills. Is there anything where you can say to an organization, yes, get curious, listen to folks? Is there anything else where you think, actually, this is some great ideas of what next for you as an
yeah,
organization who's just maybe at the beginning of that journey, celebrated Pride this time around, got a taste for it now, want to find
yeah,
out more, want to be
yeah,
inclusive?
definitely. And I think that's such a good point, because LGBTQA plus people exist all year round. So
Yes,
it's
exactly.
lovely to do
Yeah,
it during Pride, and that can be when our attention is drawn to the matter. That's fantastic. But these people are in your organization all of the time. These are
yes.
people that will be wanting to join your organization at some point, and they will exist as themselves all of the time. So it is then about trying to do the work within the culture of your organization to look at how are we best supporting people from this and other marginalized backgrounds. So that could be engaging with professionals, and such as myself and so many other people who have really specialist and specific knowledge about how you can create a more inclusive culture. You can bring in guest speakers to talk about their lived experience. So when I was saying that, get to know people who are outside of your comfort zone, like, a really brilliant way to do that is to bring in guest speakers. And there are so many people that talk about this topic specifically, and they bring their own lived experience, and they do it from a place of, they know what they feel safe to share, and they know exactly how to share it, and they can then walk away from your organization and they can make sure they've got support separately. So it's a really good way of introducing a topic that doesn't rely on people in your own organization to have that educational burden on your behalf, because that is something that we can often see where we have, and it's not saying don't obviously allow people to share their own experiences, but it is about make sure you're not kind of exploiting your staff through their own lived experiences for your own educational purposes, when you can actually engage with someone who knows how to do it professionally and has got all of the right safeguarding techniques kind of available to them as well. Yeah.
Yeah, thank you. And I think it is important because in order for folks within our organisations to speak up, they've got to feel safe, right?
Yeah.
And so somebody might be really passionate, think, I really do want to speak up, and maybe this battle thinking, but maybe that's going to make me a little bit vulnerable if I share in those
Absolutely.
ways. So
Yeah,
I like the
absolutely.
idea of, yes, within the organisation, but also without, you bringing people in, and that ultimately supports the community as well, isn't it? In terms of people
Totally.
who, this is their day job, to raise awareness and
Exactly. Yeah.
build those followings. So yeah,
And you'll have access to a broad range of people that can come and do that.
yes,
So you're not just relying, especially if you're a small organization, you may not have many people. So you kind of think, well, we want to do our best so we can make sure our culture is inclusive. And then, if we maybe know that perhaps, or assume or believe that we don't have any non-binary people within our organization, but we want to make this a safe space, then put that work in first, create the awareness, have the conversations before it's needed, so that yours is a safe space for someone to say, I'm a non-binary person and I can come and work there because you will understand how this is. I know that I'm not going to get misgendered. I know that people are really going to make the effort. I know that you will have looked at your policies to make sure that they have got neutral language in them. That you're certainly, there's a lot of emphasis around things like parental policies. They can be very easily we look at, I'm an HR person, right, in my background. We write those policies, we stick them in a file online, don't we? I was going to say in a cupboard, but that's quite a while ago. It's an online file somewhere, and they only get looked at when they need doing, or when the 3-yearly review comes around, if we're lucky. So things fall through the cracks. So it's like, take the opportunity to just review them, to just have a look and say, how is this going to be read by people with multiple identities if they pick it up? Like, how's it going to feel? Are we really doing our best? And is it in service of our employees?
really wise words. Thank you, Katie. I want to ask you then about the future, because you've been really honest during this conversation. We can't thank you enough, talking about your own childhood, and from times where it wasn't great to speak about these identities and talk about the communities in these ways that we do now. So I'm hoping we're going to better times. I know we're not there yet, but I'd love to hear your thoughts on what you think the future of pride as a
Mm.
movement, but also then, the almost the purpose of pride, the awareness, the understanding, um, in terms of the workplace. What do you think the future holds for us in order to be seriously supporting our LGBTQIA plus community, Katie?
That's a really good question, and it really is a good question, because we're kind of poised, aren't we, in a governmental moment. And if we think about that, that's what sets a lot of our educational standards, and that's then what informs, I'm going to go loosely, how our kids grow up, how they learn what is acceptable. So we're kind of teetering, I feel, on the edge of something, and it's going to go in whichever direction it goes in. And that could either be quite problematic, or it might, take a bit of a turn, and it might become something that is going to be more inclusive. And then that flows through into our organizations and our workforces, doesn't it? Because obviously, we're all human people going through the journey of life, and at some point we're probably going to have to do a job, and that will involve going to a workplace. So I think there's so much conversation at the minute around how, I guess, like, young people get this, and I'm like, well, to some extent, yes, because they are certainly having a lot more open conversations than I ever did, because Section 28 existed when I was at school, so we didn't talk about these things; it was illegal. And a lot of the younger generation don't realise that was the case. But so there's a lot more conversation happening, which I think is fantastic. And we need to make sure we keep it that way. We need to make sure that there is safety for people to have their own explorations, to make up their own minds about who they are, and for us to create workplaces that they can be themselves, and thrive. And in terms of the future of kind of pride and workplace inclusion, I mean, I can't see the need for pride going away anywhere, right? But rights are currently being eroded as quickly as they've been given. Certainly when it comes to transgender people, that is, I mean, I hate the term debate, because I think it is a human's identity. I don't think we should be debating that. I don't think that's right, but it is a topic of conversation because we have got very divisive public opinion about that. I don't think that it's right that should become a voting tactic, but hey, we have to always vote for from my perspective, for the most marginalized people, because that, I think, gives us the best community outcomes. However, I don't think pride's going anywhere, I guess is what I'm trying to say. Like, this need is always going to be there up until the point that we have absolute equal rights for everybody, regardless of their gender or their sexual orientation. And I say that as well as an ace person. Like, my rights aren't protected under the Equality Act at all. So sexual orientation, as in your attraction to another person, is protected, but lack of it isn't. So if we take religion as the comparator, you have the right, a protected right, to have a religious belief or to not have a religious belief. Doesn't apply to sexual orientation, because we're just not there yet, because the assumption is everybody experiences it. So for me, immediately, there is work still to be done. So that for me is the future. It's really about understanding, these boxes that we try to fit people in just aren't appropriate anymore. And how can we educate ourselves about that? And how can we make sure that that flows through into the workplace? And I think a lot of organizations are going to get to a point where they have to decide where they stand on some of these topics. Because ultimately, when we talk about culture and we talk about values, it's around, what do you believe is fundamentally important? And at some point, you're either going to have to come out in support of your employees who identify in whichever way they identify, or you're going to maybe toe a line somewhere else and say, no, we don't support that. And it's probably going to come, obviously we know we have to respect legislation and be legally compliant, but at some point you're going to have to decide as an organization what your standpoint is on a lot of these topics, and so that you can support your employees whichever way that goes.
Yeah, thank you. I guess, the idea that pride is not going anywhere soon is a message of hope, because yes, we live in some challenging times where pride is very much needed in order to protect the rights of the communities. On the back of that, then, the last question I've got before we go to the chat box, Katie, is what inspirational messages would you give to folks listening to this? You're such an inspirational person, so thank you. What message would you like to share on this platform?
I mean, this is funny. I don't think I'm inspirational. I'm
You
just
are.
I'm just somebody who just says, I'm like, here, this is who I am. I'll share it if it's useful with anybody, and if it's not, well, that's all right. You can ignore me. I don't mind. I think for me, again, it comes back to that curiosity piece, and just like, I'm a huge believer in building connection with other humans, and I genuinely believe that involves like taking an interest, be curious about other people, and listen to the experiences of other people, and believe them. Believe them when they tell them about their life experiences, and then kind of do your own reflecting on that and think, well, how would it be different if those were my experiences? And gosh, if I had to live like that, what would be different about my day or my week or my life? And just see what you can't learn from just having that curiosity and connection. And given that, my whole ethos really is about doing this all courageously and without the fear of putting your foot in it, like, just know, like, at some point you're going to get it wrong, right? Let's all just own that. We're going to get the letters wrong. We're going to say the wrong thing. You're going to misgender someone. I've done it today, but it's not acceptable. It's something we have to apologize for. But it happens, and you have to own that, and then we have to move on. Like, people make mistakes, but it's about how are we doing the learning and how are we doing the work to show up in support of other people. So yeah, get curious and don't worry about putting your foot in it. You're going to stuff it up. It's all right. You'll survive.
Yeah, thank you. I think that's very reassuring for people who maybe don't know a lot about this subject, want to, but terrified of upsetting people.
Yeah.
And, to make sure that we all are aware that, you did misgender, you apologise. The person that you did misgender came back, no problem, thanks. And that's what we need, isn't it? Like you say,
Yeah.
to be comfortable, say, oh, I'm really sorry. And then the person is like, yeah, that's okay. And now we move on. And
Yeah,
thank you for
exactly. Yeah.
acknowledging that. Thank you, Katie. I've learnt a lot from chatting with you. I knew I would. And hopefully everybody else listening to this conversation. There's lots to think about here. And we've got lots of comments in the chat. So I'm not going to use names because we want to keep it just the conversation flowing in that way. And we also don't want to try and get too political. We are just on the brink here in the UK of a general election. But also I think it would be very what's the word? Naive and maybe even disrespectful to not speak about what's happening within the LGBTQIA plus community within some of our political parties here in the UK at the moment. So
Mm.
we need to acknowledge that because there are issues here, but obviously we don't want to get too political
Yeah.
either on a platform like this. But we do have a question um, around, I suppose, how can I'm trying to rephrase the question, Casey, so it isn't too political. But we do have this situation where there is a particular political party who is almost campaigning on a platform of not wishing to educate
Yeah.
on trans and non-binary identities. And thank you for the person in the chat who's raised this. And I'm guessing, Casey, this is coming back to what you're saying about the role of pride as we may be going into uncertain times for this community.
Yeah. And it's interesting, right? So it will surprise nobody. I've got very particular views on this. But I think I always find it curious, and I can do this without naming any particular party because it probably applies to several. But when it comes to generally the conversation that unfolds around transgender identity, generally is always aimed at transgender women. So let's call that out firstly, because transgender men, I'm not saying that they get off the hook. They go completely unacknowledged, which for me is also horribly problematic. It's almost as if they don't exist, and that's not true. But it's always transgender women that come under the most fire. And for me, that is built around the fact that we have a society, and our systemic society is based on patriarchy. So we see women as less than. So we're operating then in this space where transgender women, particularly, are a target. And I think it's much easier when we think about the concerns that people raise, and it tends to come around, the use of single sex spaces. Again, my beliefs are transgender women are women, so welcome in my spaces, that's fine. But there's fear that is placed around that, and it's all around safety. However, for me, I don't believe that the fear should be directed at transgender women. I think when we're talking about the safety of single sex spaces, the thing we need to be addressing is rape culture. The thing that we need to be addressing is misogyny. That is what is so dangerous to women. It's not individual people, regardless of their gender identity. It's the culture that perpetuates that. And I often then get curious, like, well, what's easiest to address? Is it easy to address like rape culture within, well, say within the UK? It's global, but within the UK, is it easy to address misogyny? No, it's not. Is it going to get you votes doing that? Probably not, because where do we see most of this being enacted? So there's the systems of oppression that uphold it. So for me, it's just a vote spinner, isn't it, to say, well, we don't want to fix this problem, but if we can point over here to this problem, we'll send it over there. It keeps people over here feeling safe and secure and confident, and we've got someone that we can pin the blame on. And that's then where all the conversation is generated from. And we're creating an enemy where one does not need to exist. And this is systems of oppression, like at its core, isn't it? It's about finding someone to blame who is generally of a marginalized identity, so that we can other them, and everybody else feels, okay, phew, it's not me, let's send it over there, because we don't really understand.
Yeah, thank you. And you've got lots of comments supporting what you've just shared there, Katie. It's a really important but a very delicate conversation at the moment. We know that, people get very passionate around these issues, but I'm so appreciative that we're able to give it a platform in this way because, it elicits a lot of responses from folks. And it's important, I think, for us as an organizations, when we're trying to figure out, you said a little bit earlier about, okay, where is the line that we're going to tread with this in terms of supporting our employees, about the culture that we want to create within our organizations as well. On the back of that culture, you spoke a bit about, your HR documents that maybe have got,
Yeah.
lots of genderized language and so on in. How important then, we've got a question about the importance of neutral gender
Yeah.
language. Is that the way forward about how we're going to write our policies and so on?
I mean, again, biased opinion coming from me, but totally.
Yeah.
And I just think, why would we not? Because do you remember the days, letters, when we had pens and paper, we wrote letters, it always started with dear sirs. right? Because it was all about men. Like that was the default. And then society recognized, like, oh, hang on a minute, you know, there was women in the workplace now, so we're writing to someone who doesn't identify as a man. And then it was dear sir and madam. And it's like, and now if we ever think about writing something like that, it's just like, what? That feels really gross, doesn't it? Like we just wouldn't do that anymore. And I just think, why are we trying to fit everybody into these two binary gender buckets when actually we can just use completely gender neutral language? It applies to absolutely everybody. Like nobody is excluded. Everybody is included. Why would we not make that the default? Like, why
Yeah.
not? That it baffles me that we're still, you know, doing kind of like, you know, he or she, and it's just like we don't need to do that. It doesn't matter.
No, no, brilliant, thank you. And it's a smallish detail, but means so much, doesn't it? It's got lots of layers to it, including giving the message of the culture within our
Yeah.
organisation, isn't it? If we are
Yeah.
sharing our preferred pronouns, if we are neutralising gender from our documents and so on.
Yeah. And I
Um,
always feel, just to build on that as well, is if there is anything that you can do, and although I know a lot of conversations tend to come out around reasonable adjustments, but if there is anything that you can do for everybody in your workforce, so yes, it might have come about as an idea because it will benefit some people, but actually if it benefits more people and you can do it as standard, why would you not do it as standard? Just do the thing that helps everybody, regardless of what it is or who it benefits. If it can be of benefit to more people, just do it. Like make it the norm. Because again, I do, just to trot things out, I always say, like, there's no such thing as normal, only the things as a society that we have normalized. And that
yeah,
changes, right? When I was at school, Pluto was a planet. Apparently it's not anymore. So like if science can change its mind and normalize different things,
yeah,
why is it so hard?
yeah. I love it. Thank you, Katie. Wow, this has been such a brilliant conversation. Thank you for your honesty. You are inspirational, whether you think you are or not. And we certainly think you are here at NoraBox. So thank you so much for, sharing your wisdom in that way with us. um, Everybody who's listening, this is a really interesting conversation, isn't it? We know that, a lot of folks have opinions around these. Some of us are maybe a bit scared to ask questions. We hope what this conversation's done, though, is, we've heard from Katie to say that it's okay to ask. It's okay to apologise if we inadvertently make a mistake, and we can move on from there. I think the most important thing, Katie, you probably agree, is we can just keep talking about this. That curiosity, I love it.
Yeah.
Um, so, everyone, we wish you a very curious rest of the day then as we explore these issues. And that just leaves me to say another thank you to Katie, but thank you for everybody who's listening as well.
Thank you. And thank you, everybody.